First of all, I'd like to say it is not necessary to go abroad to be a great poet. We have Wallace Stevens, who was tremendously influenced by French poetry and really only went to Florida. We don't want to think about what he did there. I think it's probably useful to distinguish between American poets who travel abroad and make that experience part of their poetry. So if you think about a great book like James Wright's last book, This Journey, his trip to Italy is crucial to the book. And the crucial part of it is it goes him back and forth between his experience in Ohio, it was a kind of infernal experience, in Italy, which becomes a kind of paradiso. And or John Barrowman, the section of his dream songs that are in Ireland, or Richard Hugo's letter poems where he goes abroad and writes back to friends. And then different kinds of consequences for poets who go to live in other countries. If you think about H.D. in Greece and how her poetry was influenced by Greek poetry, and you think of T.S. Eliot and his mimicking of English poetry and pretending to be an English person, and what that was consequence for a really great poem like Four Quartets. The key thing here is that they're all writing back to American poetry, and that they're not really part of Irish poetry, or it's not that they don't have an influence. When Robert Lowell lives in England, you can see a group of English poets being influenced by Lowell at the end of his life. But Lowell's sonnets are not really part of the bloodstream of English poetry, they're really part of the bloodstream of American poetry. And American poetry has been continually infused by the influence of poets going abroad, not just by their travels or their living, but by bringing back the influence of the poems that they're influenced by. The same way that the Arabic poets influenced the troubadours, and so Arabic poetry had an influence on troubadour poetry, so does H.D.'s influence of Greek poetry influence imagism and come into the bloodstream of American poetry, which is much richer and more cosmopolitan than people might think. And then there's another way that I just like to introduce this subject to you, which is the story of American poets and American poetry abroad, and how American poetry is understood abroad, because we've all had the experience when we go abroad that there's a certain narrative about American poetry which we know to be different than our own narrative, and can be somewhat complicated because certain stories about American poetry export very well. And I myself have, and others don't. And my own experience of reading certain American poets can be oddly and interestingly influenced by the filter of reading it through a foreign poetry, or another way a poet is influenced. And the story, the one I want to leave you with, is the remarkable influence of Walt Whitman around the world, and the reception of Whitman, which is extremely interesting. For example, at the very moment that Walt Whitman was being, let's say that Whitman was being condescended to by T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, who treated him as if he were kind of Carl Sandburg. And they were influenced by free verse, or vers libre, through Jules Laforgue, but Laforgue was tremendously influenced by Whitman in his version of free verse. And the way I understand Whitman is complicated by the fact that Whitman always had an international influence, but it was wildly different on different poets. And if you think of, say, Nazim Hikmet or Mayakovsky, they're influenced by one version of Whitman. And then you think of a great Portuguese poet like Pessoa, and he's influenced by another reading of Whitman. In his poem Salutation to Walt Whitman, he goes, "I am not unworthy of you, Walt Whitman, even though I come to you wearing a frock coat and a top hat." And this is really pronounced when you read Whitman through the lens of Latin America, because two of the great Latin American poets, who despised each other, by the way, Neruda and Borges, are both tremendously influenced by Whitman. But Neruda is influenced by the socially committed Whitman, and Borges is influenced by another Whitman. It all turns on whether you decide whether or not Whitman, the person, the author, is the same as the speaker in the poem. When Whitman says, "I'm a rough, one of the cosmoses," walking around through the streets, one of the people, Pablo Neruda takes that Whitman and the author, Walt Whitman, to be the same. And he creates a model for his own poems based on this Whitmanian figure. But Jorge Luis Borges thinks, he has a piece called Whitman and I, and he also has a poem called Walt Whitman, where he goes, yo fui Walt Whitman, I was Walt Whitman. He says that there's a tremendous gap between Walt Whitman, the figure in the poem, and Walt Whitman, the shy librarian who fantasized walking amongst the people and created this other cosmos, that the speaker in Whitman's poems is a kind of fiction. Now, whether you take that speaker to be a fiction or the true person will lead to greatly different consequences, and it's also true if you play it out in the line of American poetry. So you read that back into American poetry, based on what we've learned from Neruda and Borges, and you could see that Whitman will go one way through, say, Allen Ginsberg, and another way through Wallace Stevens and Elizabeth Bishop, who also were influenced. That is, a romantic, removed Whitman, or a social, politically commitment, engaged Whitman. And so it's a different way of reading Whitman, which I learned through the lens of other poetries. I feel much better. Thank you.